The blazing sun hung like a merciless eye in the cloudless Montana sky, as Thomas Reed spotted something unusual at the edge of his wheat field, a figure stumbling, then collapsing in a heap of faded fabric and dust. At first he thought it might be a wounded animal or perhaps a mirage born of the relentless heat that had plagued the summer of 1876. But as he approached, the wheat parting before him like a golden sea, he realized it was a woman. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, adjusting the worn Stetson that shaded his face as he quickened his pace. At 32, he had grown accustomed to the solitude of his modest ranch 15 miles outside of Silver Creek. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and visitors were rare enough that the sight of this stranger set his heart racing. When he reached her, she lay face down, her dark hair spilling across the dry earth. Her dress, once fine by the look of the fabric, was torn and covered in the dust of long travel. For a moment he feared she might be dead. "Madam," Thomas knelt beside her, gently turning her over. "Madam, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, deep brown eyes that seemed to take a moment to focus on his face. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her skin hot to the touch. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. Thomas uncorked his canteen and carefully lifted her head, bringing the container to her lips. "Small sips," he instructed. "Too much at once will make you sick." She obeyed, taking small, desperate swallows of the lukewarm liquid. After a few moments, she seemed to regain some awareness, her eyes clearing as she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she managed. "What's your name, madam, and how'd you come to be out here? There's nothing for miles." She attempted to sit up and Thomas helped steady her. "Nora," she said, "Nora Winters." Then her eyes clouded and she pressed a hand to her forehead. I was traveling to Silver Creek, our stagecoach. There were men with guns. A robbery," Thomas thought grimly. The stagecoach route that ran 10 miles north of his property had seen its share of holdups in recent months. "The others?" he asked, Nora's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. There was shooting. I ran. I've been walking for, I don't know how long." Thomas glanced at the sun's position. It would be dark in a few hours, and the woman was clearly in no condition to travel further. "My ranch house is just over that rise," he said, pointing toward the modest homestead barely visible in the distance. "Can you walk with help, or shall I carry you?" Pride flashed in her eyes. "I can walk," she insisted, though when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Without a word, Thomas scooped her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite the layers of her travel clothing. She didn't protest, which told him more about her exhaustion than any words could have. "I'm Thomas Reed," he said as he began the walk back to his house. "You're safe now, Miss Winters." She didn't respond, and when he glanced down, he saw that she had slipped into unconsciousness again, her head resting against his shoulder. The walk back to his house seemed longer than usual with the woman's weight in his arms. His mind raced with questions. Who exactly was this Nora Winters? What business did she have in Silver Creek? And what had happened to the others on that stagecoach? By the time he reached his front porch, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. His dog, Buck, a loyal cattle dog with one blue eye and one brown, rose from his spot on the porch and approached cautiously, sniffing at the stranger in his master's arms. "It's all right, boy," Thomas assured him. "She's a guest." He managed to open the door and carried Nora inside, laying her gently on his own bed. It wasn't much, a sturdy wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress covered in clean linens, but it was better than the floor or the small cot he kept for rare visitors. Thomas dampened a cloth in the water basin and gently cleaned the dust from her face. In the better light of the cabin, he could see that she was a handsome woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with features that spoke of refinement. Her hands, though dirty from her ordeal, showed no calluses or signs of hard labor. A city woman, then. Perhaps from back east. He removed her boots and covered her with a light blanket, then set about preparing a simple supper of beans and bacon, knowing she would need nourishment when she woke. As he worked, he kept glancing toward the bed, troubled by the unexpected turn his day had taken. Thomas had lived alone since returning from the war 11 years ago. After witnessing the horrors at Shiloh and countless other battlefields, he had sought the peace and isolation of the Montana Territory, purchasing this land with his military pay and building his life one quiet day at a time. He kept to himself, made occasional trips to town for supplies, and was content with the company of his livestock and buck. The sudden presence of this woman disrupted the careful rhythm of his existence. Yet, as he stirred the beans simmering in the cast iron pot, he couldn't deny the strange stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to remember. A soft moan from the bed caught his attention. Nora was awakening, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar room until they settled on him. "Where?" she began, her voice stronger than before. "My home," Thomas answered, approaching with a cup of water. "You fainted. Drink this." Nora pushed herself to sitting position and accepted the cup with shaking hands. "How long was I unconscious?" "Not long, maybe half an hour," she nodded, taking careful sips. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this, Mr. Reed." "Thomas," he corrected, "and there's no imposition. Couldn't very well leave you out there." For the first time, a small smile touched her lips, transforming her face. "No, I suppose not. Still, I'm grateful." "Food's nearly ready," he said, returning to the stove. "Nothing fancy, but it'll give you strength." Nora looked down at her filthy dress and frowned. "I must look a fright." Thomas cleared his throat. "I don't have much in the way of women's things, but I can heat some water if you'd like to wash up. Got an old shirt of mine you could wear while your dress dries." Gratitude flooded her face. "That would be wonderful." While Thomas heated water, Nora told him more about what had happened. The stagecoach had been carrying 5 passengers: herself, an elderly couple heading to visit their son in Silver Creek, a businessman from Denver, and a young man traveling to work in the silver mines. 3 masked men had stopped them 10 miles out from the last way station. "They wanted valuables," she explained as Thomas set a bowl of beans before her. "When the businessman resisted, they shot him, right there in front of us." Her voice trembled. "The driver tried to flee, but they shot him too. In the confusion, I slipped out the far side of the coach and ran into the brush. I heard more gunshots as I fled." Thomas's jaw tightened. "These robberies have been getting worse. Sheriff's barely keeping up. Do you think the others?" She couldn't finish the question. "Hard to say," Thomas answered honestly. "If they surrendered their valuables, the bandits might have left them be. Stage company will have noticed a missing coach by now. They'll send someone looking." Nora nodded, though her eyes remained troubled. After finishing her meal, Thomas showed her to the small washroom attached to the cabin, leaving her with heated water, soap, and one of his clean shirts. "I'll be outside tending to the animals," he said. "Take your time." In the barn, as Thomas fed his 2 horses and milk cow, he contemplated riding into town the next day to alert the sheriff about Nora's arrival and the stagecoach robbery. It would be a day's ride there and back, meaning he'd have to leave her alone at the ranch. The thought made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite articulate why. When he returned to the cabin, Nora was seated at the table, her dark hair damp and hanging loose around her shoulders. She wore his shirt, which engulfed her smaller frame, making her appear even more vulnerable than before. Her dress and undergarments hung from a line he'd strung across one corner of the cabin. "I feel human again," she said with a small smile. "Thank you," Thomas nodded, suddenly awkward in his own home. "You can take the bed tonight," he said. "I'll make up the cot for myself." "I couldn't possibly. You need the rest more than I do," he insisted. "Besides, I've slept in worse places." As darkness fell outside, Thomas lit the oil lamps and built up the fire in the small stove to ward off the night chill that descended even in summer at this elevation. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. "Do you have family in Silver Creek?" Thomas finally asked. Nora's expression changed subtly. "No," she said after a pause. "I was traveling there for a fresh start." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Thomas didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their reasons for seeking new beginnings in these remote territories. He had his own. "Silver Creek's a decent town," he offered. Growing fast with the silver strikes, but the people are mostly good folks. And you, she asked. Have you been here long? 11 years. Came west after the war. Recognition flickered in her eyes. You fought in the war between the states, Thomas nodded, his expression shuddering slightly. Union Army, Tennessee and Georgia mostly. My brother fought as well, she said softly. He didn't come home. I'm sorry, Thomas replied, meaning it. Many didn't. Another silence fell, but not an uncomfortable one. There was an understanding between them now, a shared awareness of loss that needed no elaboration. Eventually, Nora's eyelids began to droop, the day's trauma and exhaustion catching up with her. Thomas showed her to the bed and made up the cot for himself, placing it near the door. If you need anything in the night, don't hesitate to wake me, he said. Nora slipped under the covers, her eyes already closing. Thank you, Thomas, she murmured, for everything. Long after her breathing had deepened into sleep, Thomas lay awake on his cot, listening to the familiar night sounds of his ranch mingling with the unfamiliar presence of another person under his roof. Despite the circumstances, there was something comforting about it, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing all these years. With that thought lingering in his mind, he finally drifted off to sleep. The morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows. Thomas had risen early, as was his habit, and was quietly preparing breakfast when Nora stirred. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was. Her gaze found Thomas at the stove, his back to her as he worked. Good morning, she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Thomas turned, a small smile touching his usually solemn face. Morning, hope you're hungry, got flapjacks and bacon. Nora ran a hand through her tangled hair, suddenly conscious of her appearance. I must look a fright, she said, echoing her words from the previous evening. You look just fine, Thomas replied, then quickly turned back to his cooking as if embarrassed by the comment. After a hearty breakfast, Nora insisted on helping with the dishes despite Thomas's protests. As they worked side by side, she bringing a domestic harmony to his bachelor kitchen that had never existed before, she asked about his plans for the day. Need to ride into town, he said. Let the sheriff know about what happened to your stagecoach. Maybe there's news about the other passengers. Nora's hands stilled in the wash basin. I see. You're welcome to stay here, Thomas added quickly. It's a full day's ride there and back. I wouldn't expect you to make that journey in your condition. Relief flooded her features. Thank you. I don't think I could face another long journey just yet. I'll leave Buck with you, Thomas said, referring to his faithful dog. He's good company and will alert you to any strangers. Something flickered across Nora's face at the mention of strangers, a flash of fear that Thomas couldn't help but notice. Is there someone specific you're afraid might be looking for you? He asked carefully. Nora dried her hands on a towel, her gaze fixed on the floor. It's a long story, she said finally, and not one I'm proud of. Thomas leaned against the counter, giving her space but making it clear he was willing to listen. We've all got stories like that, I reckon. She looked up at him, searching his face for judgment and finding none. I was engaged, she began, to a man named Victor Hargrove. He's a banker's son from Chicago, wealthy and respected. My father arranged the match. Thomas nodded, understanding immediately the world she came from so different from his own. At first, Victor seemed kind, charming even, Nora continued. But after our engagement was announced, I began to see another side of him. He was controlling, possessive. When I expressed doubts about the marriage, he became angry, frightening. Her hands twisted the dish towel anxiously. My father wouldn't hear of breaking the engagement. The Hargroves were too important to his business interests. So I ran. She looked up, a defiant light in her eyes despite the shame in her voice. I took my mother's jewelry, sold most of it, and bought a ticket west. I thought if I could get far enough away, start a new life, they wouldn't find me. And now you're worried this Victor might come looking for you, Thomas concluded. Nora nodded. He's a proud man, being jilted publicly. He won't simply let it go. And he has the resources to send people searching. Thomas considered this information carefully. It explained her wariness, her reluctance to go directly to town. A woman traveling alone already invited scrutiny, a woman fleeing an engagement even more so. Silver Creek's a small place, he said finally. Word gets around fast. If someone comes asking after a woman of your description, people will talk. I know, she whispered. I had hoped to find work there, perhaps as a teacher or shopkeeper's assistant, something respectable but unnoticed. Thomas thought about the growing town, with its mix of miners, merchants, and the occasional well-bred family establishing new enterprises in the West. A woman like Nora, educated, refined, would stand out despite her best efforts. There's another option, he said slowly, hardly believing what he was about to suggest. You could stay here for a while until you're certain no one's looking for you. Surprise widened Nora's eyes. Here, but that would be imposing terribly on your hospitality. It's a working ranch, Thomas replied with a shrug that belied the rapid beating of his heart. Always more work than hands to do it. You could help out, earn your keep if that makes you more comfortable. And no one would think to look for a Chicago banker's daughter-in-law to be on a remote cattle ranch. Nora appeared to consider the offer, her gaze traveling around the modest but neat cabin. You barely know me, she said finally. Why would you do this for a stranger? Thomas couldn't quite articulate the feeling that had been growing in him since finding her in his wheat field. Something about her presence filled an emptiness he hadn't even realized existed until now. Out here, folks help each other, he said simply. It's how we survive. A slow smile spread across Nora's face, transforming it. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Reed, with gratitude. Thomas, he corrected again. Thomas, she echoed, and something in the way she said his name made his chest tighten. Before riding to town, Thomas showed Nora around the small ranch, the chicken coop, where she could gather eggs in the morning, the vegetable garden that needed weeding, the spring house where milk and butter were kept cool. She listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that suggested she was quick to learn despite her city upbringing. I won't be back until after dark, he told her as he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Scout. Buck will stay with you. There's a rifle above the door if you need it, though I don't expect trouble. Nora nodded, standing in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, looking both determined and vulnerable in her newly dried dress. Be careful, she said. Thomas tipped his hat to her. Always am. As he rode away, he glanced back once to see her still standing there, watching him go, Buck sitting faithfully at her side. The image stayed with him as he made the long ride to Silver Creek, a warm presence in his thoughts that made the journey seem shorter than usual. Silver Creek had grown considerably since Thomas's last visit a month ago. New buildings were going up along the main street, and the constant sound of hammering filled the air. The discovery of a rich silver vein in the nearby mountains had transformed what had once been a sleepy settlement into a bustling frontier town. Thomas tied Scout outside the sheriff's office and entered to find Sheriff James Donovan at his desk, poring over wanted posters. Thomas Reed, the sheriff said, looking up with surprise. Twice in one season, must be some kind of record. Thomas smiled thinly at the good-natured ribbing. His preference for solitude was well known in town. Got news you should hear, Jim, he said, taking a seat across from the lawman. Had a visitor arrive at my place yesterday. Woman named Nora Winters. Says she was on the stagecoach that was robbed north of here, managed to escape during the holdup. The sheriff's expression darkened. We got word of that yesterday. Stage company sent out riders when the coach didn't arrive on schedule. Found it about 12 miles north of town. And the passengers? Thomas asked, his chest tightening. Driver and one passenger dead. The others were left alive, though robbed of everything valuable. They're recovering at Doc Miller's place. Relief flooded Thomas. At least Nora wouldn't have more deaths on her conscience. This woman, the sheriff continued, she's staying with you, Thomas nodded. For now, she was in pretty rough shape when I found her. Walked miles through the heat after escaping the robbery. She's welcome to come give a statement when she's able. Might help us track down these bandits. That's the third stage robbery in 2 months. I'll let her know, Thomas promised, though he felt a twinge of unease at the thought of bringing Nora into town, where she might be recognized if anyone was indeed looking for her. After leaving the sheriff's office, Thomas completed his usual errands purchasing supplies at the general store, stopping by the blacksmith to discuss horseshoes for his team and visiting the post office to check for mail. As he worked his way through town, he kept his ears open for any mention of strangers asking after a woman matching Nora's description, but heard nothing suspicious. His last stop was the saloon, not for drink but for information. The Silverado was the center of town gossip, and its bartender, a man called Welsh, knew everything that happened within 50 miles. "Reed," Welsh acknowledged as Thomas approached the bar. "Unusual seeing you twice in the same month." "Just passing through," Thomas replied, ordering a beer he didn't particularly want but which would give him reason to linger. "Town's growing fast," Welsh nodded, wiping down the bar top with a rag of questionable cleanliness. "Silver strikes brought all sorts, some good, some not so much." He leaned forward. "Heard about that stagecoach robbery?" Thomas nodded. "Sheriff filled me in. Terrible business," Welsh continued. "But that's not all that's got people talking. Had some fancy fellow in here yesterday asking questions." Thomas's hand tightened around his glass. "What kind of questions?" "Looking for a woman. Dark-haired, well-spoken, said she was his sister run off from Chicago after some family quarrel," Welsh shrugged, "offering a reward for information leading to finding her." Thomas kept his expression neutral with effort. "He's still in town." "Nah, rode out this morning, said he was checking all the settlements in the territory." Welsh studied Thomas's face. "Why, you know something about this missing woman?" "Just curious," Thomas replied, finishing his beer in one long swallow. Never a dull moment in Silver Creek these days. As he rode home in the gathering dusk, Thomas's mind raced. The timing was too coincidental. The man asking questions had to be connected to Victor Hargrove, perhaps hired to track down Nora, and he was methodically searching the territory. It was only a matter of time before he circled back to Silver Creek, perhaps with more specific information about the woman who had escaped the stagecoach robbery. Thomas would need to warn Nora, prepare her for the possibility that her past was catching up to her faster than she had anticipated. The lights of his cabin came into view as he crested the final hill, a warm glow in the deepening twilight that quickened his pace. The smell of cooking greeted him as he approached something rich and savory that made his stomach growl in anticipation. Buck raced out to meet him, barking a welcome, and then the door opened, spilling more light into the yard. Nora stood framed in the doorway, her hair pulled back neatly, wearing one of his old shirts belted over her skirt like an apron. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Said I would be," he replied, dismounting and leading Scout to the barn. "Something smells good. Rabbit stew," she called after him. "Buck caught a rabbit near the garden and I thought, well, I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty." Thomas smiled to himself as he unsaddled Scout and made sure the horse had feed and water. In just one day, Nora had begun to make herself at home, finding ways to contribute. The thought warmed him more than he cared to admit. When he entered the cabin, he found the table set neatly, the stew bubbling in his old iron pot and fresh biscuits cooling on a plate. The cabin itself was cleaner than it had been in years, the floors swept, surfaces dusted, and his few possessions arranged with care. "You've been busy," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Nora wiped her hands on her makeshift apron, looking suddenly uncertain. "I wanted to thank you for your hospitality. I hope I haven't overstepped." "Not at all," he assured her quickly. "Place has never looked better." They ate together at the small table, and Thomas told her what he had learned in town that the other passengers had survived, that the sheriff would like her statement when she was able to come to town, and finally, reluctantly, about the man asking questions. Nora's face paled at this last piece of news. "It's starting already," she whispered. "I thought I'd have more time." "He's gone for now," Thomas said, "but likely to return. We should be prepared." She looked up at him, her dark eyes troubled. I offered you shelter," Thomas said firmly. "I don't make offers lightly." Gratitude and something else, something warmer, filled her expression. "Thank you," she said simply. That night, as they sat before the fire, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in years. He told Nora about growing up in Pennsylvania, about his service in the war and the nightmares that still occasionally haunted him, about coming west to find peace and building this ranch from nothing. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Chicago, her love of books and learning, and her dreams of a life where she could make her own choices rather than having them dictated by her father or a husband. "Is that why you agreed to stay here?" Thomas asked. "Because I gave you the choice." Nora considered this, the firelight playing across her thoughtful face. "Partly," she admitted. "But also because when you found me in that field, you didn't just give me water, you gave me dignity. You treated me like a person, not a possession or a problem." Her words stirred something deep in Thomas's chest, a feeling he had believed long buried beneath years of solitude and self-sufficiency. "It's getting late," he said, rising from his chair to break the moment before it overwhelmed him. "We both should rest." As they had the night before, Thomas took the cot and gave Nora his bed. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to her soft breathing across the room, he knew that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered existence. Whether he welcomed this change or feared it, he couldn't yet say. But he suspected that his life would never quite be the same again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Thomas taught Nora the routines of ranch life, how to milk the cow, tend the vegetable garden, and care for the chickens. She proved a quick study, approaching each new task with determination despite her city upbringing. In the evenings, they shared the cooking duties, with Nora introducing variations to Thomas's simple fare using herbs she discovered growing wild near the spring house. After supper, they would sit on the porch if the weather was fair, or by the fire if it wasn't, talking late into the night. Thomas learned that Nora had a quick wit and a love of poetry, sometimes reciting verses from memory that transported him to worlds far beyond Montana territory. She learned that, beneath his quiet exterior, Thomas harbored a deep appreciation for beauty in nature, in music, in the simple pleasures of a life lived close to the land. A week passed, then two, with no sign of trouble from town and no mention of Nora returning to her original plan of seeking work in Silver Creek. It was as if they had reached an unspoken agreement to extend her stay indefinitely, neither willing to disrupt the comfortable partnership that had developed between them. On a warm afternoon in late July, Thomas was mending a fence on the far side of his property when he spotted Nora approaching across the meadow, carrying a cloth-covered basket. Buck trotted faithfully beside her, occasionally darting off to investigate an interesting scent before returning to her side. Thomas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched her approach. She wore one of her own dresses, modified with his help to be more practical for ranch work, with her dark hair braided and pinned up neatly. The summer sun had brought a healthy glow to her skin, and her step had a confidence that had been absent when he first found her. "Thought you might be hungry," she called as she drew nearer. Thomas smiled, realizing he had indeed worked straight through the midday meal without noticing. "Thoughtful of you," he replied. They sat together in the shade of a large cottonwood tree, spreading out the simple picnic. Nora had prepared bread, cheese, cold chicken from the previous night's supper, and a jar of fresh lemonade. "I've been thinking," Nora said as they ate, "about how I can contribute more to the ranch." Thomas looked at her with surprise. "You already do more than your share," she shook her head. "The domestic tasks, yes, but there's so much more that needs doing, and you handle it all alone." "That's how it's always been," he said with a shrug, "but it doesn't have to be," she insisted. "I want to learn to ride to help with the cattle, real ranch work." Thomas studied her determined expression. The idea of Nora on horseback, helping to round up his small herd or riding fence lines, was both appealing and concerning. "Ranching's dangerous work," he said finally. "And you've never ridden before?" "Then teach me," she replied simply. "I'm a quick study, you've said so yourself." Something in her tone told Thomas this wasn't merely about pulling her weight on the ranch. This was about the independence she had sought when she fled Chicago, the freedom to try new things, to test her own limits without anyone dictating what was proper or possible for her. "All right," he agreed. We'll start tomorrow with Daisy. She's older and gentler than Scout. Nora's face lit up with such joy that Thomas felt a corresponding warmth spread through his chest. Making her happy, he realized, had become increasingly important to him. The next morning, Thomas led Daisy, a placid brown mare with a white blaze, into the corral behind the barn. Nora waited eagerly, wearing a split skirt she had fashioned from one of her dresses to allow her to ride astride. "First rule of horsemanship," Thomas said, handing her a curry comb, "is to care for your mount before and after riding, builds trust between you." He showed her how to groom Daisy properly, how to check her hooves for stones or injuries, and how to saddle her correctly. Nora listened attentively, asking questions and following his instructions with care. When it came time for her to mount, Thomas positioned himself beside Daisy's head, one hand on the bridle to steady the horse. "Left foot in the stirrup," he directed. "Grab the saddle horn and swing your right leg over." Nora hesitated only briefly before following his instructions. Her first attempt was awkward, but she managed to seat herself in the saddle without falling. "Now what?" she asked, looking both nervous and exhilarated. "Now you learn to communicate with her," Thomas replied. "Horses respond to pressure from your legs, the reins, and the shift of your weight. They can feel your fear or confidence." For the next hour, he led Daisy around the corral with Nora on her back, teaching her the basics of horsemanship. By the end of the lesson, Nora was able to guide Daisy in simple circles and stops using the reins and her legs, though she still looked uncertain about controlling the horse without Thomas's steadying presence. "You did well for a first lesson," he told her as he helped her dismount. Nora winced, rubbing her thighs. "I'll be sore tomorrow," she predicted. "That's how you know you're learning," Thomas replied with a smile. "We'll practice again tomorrow if you're up to it." Despite her soreness, Nora was eager for her second lesson the following day and her third the day after that. By the end of the week, she was riding Daisy around the corral without Thomas leading the horse, her confidence growing with each successful session. "When can we ride outside the corral?" she asked eagerly after her seventh lesson. Thomas considered her progress. She had a natural seat and good instincts, though she still had much to learn. "Soon," he promised. "Maybe this weekend we could ride to the creek. It's about a mile from here, nice and level." The prospect of this excursion buoyed Nora's spirits even further, and she threw herself into her remaining lessons with renewed enthusiasm. On Saturday morning, they set out together, Thomas on Scout and Nora on Daisy, for the small creek that ran through the eastern edge of his property. It was a perfect day for a ride, with clear skies and a gentle breeze that kept the heat bearable. Thomas watched Nora carefully as they rode, ready to assist if she had trouble controlling Daisy, but his concern proved unnecessary. She sat tall in the saddle, handling the mare with growing confidence, her face alight with the simple joy of the experience. "This is freedom," she said as they rode side by side across a meadow dotted with wildflowers. "I never understood it before what people meant when they spoke of the freedom of the West, but I feel it now." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. "It's why I came here. After the war, I couldn't bear to be hemmed in by city streets and other people's expectations. Needed sky above me and land around me." They reached the creek by mid-morning and dismounted in a shady spot where the water ran clear over smooth stones. While the horses drank downstream, Thomas and Nora sat on the grassy bank, enjoying the peacefulness of the setting. "I've been thinking," Nora said after a comfortable silence, "about what happens when autumn comes." Thomas felt a sudden tightness in his chest. "What about it?" She traced patterns in the dirt with a twig not meeting his eyes. "Winter follows, the snow, the isolation. It must be difficult, being alone during those months." "Been managing for 11 years, Thomas replied, though the thought of returning to that solitude after these weeks with Nora filled him with unexpected dread. "Yes, but—" She hesitated, then looked up at him, her expression earnest. "What if I stayed? Through the winter, I mean." The suggestion hung between them, laden with implications neither had yet put into words. Thomas had grown accustomed to her presence, to the sound of her voice, to the way she hummed while working, to the scent of her hair when they sat close together in the evenings. The thought of her leaving had begun to trouble him more with each passing day. "It's not an easy life," he said carefully. "Winter's harsh here. Snow can block the road to town for weeks, just the two of us in that small cabin." "I know," she replied softly. "I've thought about it. But the alternative, going back to Silver Creek, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if Victor's men have found me." Thomas studied her face, seeing the genuine fear there, but there was something else too, something that mirrored the growing feeling in his own heart. "You'd be welcome to stay," he said finally, "for as long as you want." A smile blossomed on her face, bright as the summer sun above them. "Thank you, Thomas." As they rode home, side by side across the rolling grassland, Thomas found himself contemplating a future he had never imagined, one that included Nora's laughter, her thoughtfulness, her courage. The solitary life he had built no longer seemed as appealing as it once had. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas gathered his courage to ask a question that had been on his mind since their conversation by the creek. "Nora," he began, his voice unusually hesitant, "when you said you wanted to stay through the winter, was it only because you fear being found?" She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the dying light. "No," she answered simply. "That's not the only reason. What are the others?" He pressed. Nora's gaze dropped to her hands, folded neatly in her lap. "I've come to care for this place," she said softly, "for the life here, for—" She looked up at him again. "For you, Thomas." The simple admission sent a rush of warmth through his chest. In the weeks since her arrival, Thomas had found himself increasingly drawn to her resilience, her kindness, her quiet strength. But he had scarcely allowed himself to hope that she might feel something similar for him. "I care for you too," he said, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. "More than I expected to care for anyone again." A soft smile curved her lips. "Is that so surprising?" "For me, yes," he admitted. "After the war, I thought that part of me was dead. Buried with too many others at Shiloh and Chickamauga." Nora reached out, her hand covering his where it rested on the porch railing. "Nothing truly good ever dies completely," she said. "It just waits for the right season to bloom again." Thomas turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. They sat like that as twilight deepened into night, connected by touch and by the unspoken understanding that something precious was growing between them, something neither had been looking for but both now cherished. August passed in a blur of shared work and quiet moments of deepening connection. Nora's riding skills improved until Thomas felt confident taking her along on simple ranch tasks, checking fence lines, moving the small herd from one pasture to another, and making preparations for the coming winter. By early September, there was a crispness in the morning air that hinted at the changing season. Thomas increased his trips to town, purchasing extra supplies and making repairs to the cabin to ensure it would be snug against the winter winds. During these absences, Nora took full charge of the ranch chores, proving herself more than capable of handling the responsibility. On one such trip to Silver Creek, Thomas noticed a change in the town's atmosphere. The initial boom of the silver strike had settled into a more sustainable pace, with fewer new arrivals and more permanent structures replacing the hasty tents and shacks of early summer. As he loaded supplies into his wagon outside the general store, Sheriff Donovan approached, his expression serious. "Thomas," he greeted. "Got a moment?" Thomas nodded, setting down a sack of flour. "What can I do for you, Jim?" The sheriff glanced around before speaking, lowering his voice. "That woman staying with you, Nora Winters, she ever tell you why she was heading to Silver Creek?" A prickle of unease ran down Thomas's spine. "Said she was looking for a fresh start. Why? Had a man come through town again yesterday. Well-dressed fellow, said he represented a banking family from Chicago, looking for a woman matching her description." The sheriff studied Thomas's face carefully. "Said she ran out on an engagement, took some valuable jewelry with her, called it theft." Thomas kept his expression neutral with effort. "That's so. He left these around town." Donovan continued, handing Thomas a folded paper. It was a wanted notice, offering a substantial reward for information leading to the whereabouts of Miss Nora Winters, dark-haired, approximately 25 years of age, educated speech and manner. The notice claimed she had stolen family heirlooms and fled a legal engagement contract. Man seemed mighty determined, the sheriff added. Left instructions to wire him in Denver if anyone had information. Thomas folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. Appreciate you letting me know, Jim. I'm not asking what's between you and the lady, Donovan said carefully. Just thought you should be aware, these banking types, they've got influence even out here. Thomas nodded grimly. I understand. One more thing, the sheriff added as Thomas prepared to depart. Stage Lines hired extra guards after those robberies. They caught one of the gang last week. Man talked, trying to save his neck. Said they've been targeting stages based on passenger lists provided by someone in Denver, looking for wealthy travelers, jewelry merchants, that sort of thing. Thomas froze, the implications sinking in. You think the robbery Nora escaped was targeted specifically? Donovan shrugged. Can't say for certain, but if someone wanted to cover up a woman's disappearance, staging a robbery where she might be presumed dead would be one way to do it. The ride home seemed interminable as Thomas turned this new information over in his mind. If Victor Hargrove had arranged the stagecoach robbery to eliminate Nora, or at least provide cover for her disappearance, it suggested a level of ruthlessness, and reach that made the threat to her safety far more serious than they had assumed. The wanted poster burned in his pocket like a brand. The accusations it contained theft, breach of contract, were clearly meant to turn public opinion against Nora, to make her a criminal rather than a victim. It was a calculated move by a man used to getting his way by whatever means necessary. When he arrived home, Thomas found Nora in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables. The sight of her hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, hands dirty from her work, humming softly to herself, filled him with a fierce protectiveness. You're back earlier than I expected, she said, looking up with a smile that faded when she saw his expression. What's wrong? Thomas dismounted, reaching into his pocket for the wanted poster. Sheriff gave me this, he said, handing it to her. They're posted all over town. Nora's face paled as she read the notice, her hands beginning to tremble. He's calling me a thief, she whispered. The jewelry was my mother's, left to me. He knows that. There's more, Thomas said, and related what the sheriff had told him about the stagecoach robberies possibly being targeted. By the time he finished, Nora had sunk onto the garden bench, the poster crumpled in her fist. He would do that, she said, her voice hollow. Arrange a robbery, maybe even murders, just to cover my disappearance or worse. Thomas sat beside her, taking her cold hands in his. Nora, look at me. She raised her eyes to his, fear and despair evident in their depths. I won't let him hurt you, Thomas said firmly. But we need to consider our options. These posters, they change things. It won't be long before someone connects you to the woman staying at my ranch. What can we do? She asked. If I leave, he'll find me eventually. If I stay, I put you in danger too. Thomas had been considering this dilemma the entire ride home. There were several possibilities, none without risk. They could flee further west or north into even more remote territories. They could attempt to gather evidence of Victor's crimes and present it to authorities. Or, there's another option, he said slowly. One that would give you legal protection from his claims. Nora looked at him questioningly. Marriage, Thomas said, the word emerging more abruptly than he had intended. As my wife, you'd be under my legal protection. The engagement contract would be nullified, and the theft accusation, well, a husband can hardly accuse his wife of stealing what would legally be their shared property. Nora's eyes widened. Thomas, are you proposing? He hadn't meant it to happen this way, blurted out as a practical solution rather than the declaration of feelings she deserved. Yet now that the word hung between them, he realized it was exactly what he wanted. Not how I would have chosen to ask, he admitted, a rueful smile touching his lips. But yes, I am. Not just for protection, though that's reason enough, because these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. Because I love you, Nora Winters, and I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears filled her eyes, but they were accompanied by a smile that transformed her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas, not just for protection, but because I love you too." He gathered her into his arms then, holding her close as relief and joy washed through him. When their lips met, it was a confirmation of everything that had been growing between them since that first day in the wheat field, a promise of a future neither had dared to imagine before finding each other. They were married 2 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Silver Creek. It was a simple ceremony in the small church at the edge of town, with only Sheriff Donovan and his wife as witnesses. Nora wore her best dress, freshly laundered and pressed, with wildflowers from the meadow forming a small bouquet. Thomas had shaved carefully and donned the one good suit he kept for rare, formal occasions. The preacher's words were traditional, speaking of honor and cherish, love and protection in sickness and in health. As Thomas placed a simple gold band on Nora's finger, purchased from the town jeweler with money he had been saving for a new plow, he felt as though his life had been leading to this moment, through war and loneliness and the vast empty spaces of the West, to find completion in her eyes. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, and Thomas kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the urgency that had hastened their wedding. They celebrated with a simple meal at the town's hotel dining room, then rode home as the sun was setting, man and wife returning to the ranch that was now truly their shared home. As they approached the cabin, now visible in the gathering dusk, Thomas reined Scout to a halt. Nora stopped Daisy beside him, looking at him curiously. "What is it?" she asked. "Tradition," he explained, dismounting and coming to stand beside her horse. "A husband is supposed to carry his bride across the threshold." A delighted laugh escaped her as she allowed him to help her down from the saddle. Thomas swept her into his arms, her weight familiar now from their months of closeness, yet somehow new in this context. "Mrs. Reed," he said, testing the name that was now hers. "Mr. Reed," she replied, her arms circling his neck as she smiled up at him. Thomas carried her to the cabin door, managed to open it without setting her down, and brought her inside to the home they would now share in name as well as in fact. As he set her gently on her feet, they both seemed to realize simultaneously the significance of this moment, their first true privacy as husband and wife. A blush colored Nora's cheeks, but there was no fear in her eyes as she reached up to touch his face. "I never thought I would marry for love," she whispered. "It seemed an impossible dream." Thomas turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I never thought I would marry at all," he admitted. "After the war, I couldn't imagine sharing my darkness with anyone." "And now?" she asked. "Now I can't imagine not sharing everything with you," he replied. "The darkness and the light." Their kiss deepened, no longer constrained by propriety or uncertainty. As night fell completely outside, they discovered each other anew, not as reluctant host and unexpected guest, but as husband and wife, bound by love as much as by the words they had spoken before the preacher. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and deepening connection. They settled into married life with surprising ease, the routines they had established during Nora's stay now taking on new meaning and permanence. Thomas found himself smiling more, laughing more, the shadows of his wartime experiences receding further with each day in Nora's presence. For her part, Nora blossomed in the security of their marriage. She took increasing responsibility for the ranch operations, proving herself a capable partner in all aspects of their life together. She started a small flock of chickens from chicks purchased in town, planted an herb garden near the kitchen door, and began making plans for expanding the vegetable garden in the spring. Their happiness, however, existed under the shadow of Victor Hargrove's continued search. On his monthly trips to town, Thomas heard rumors of a well-dressed man still making inquiries throughout the territory, though he had not returned to Silver Creek itself. The wanted posters remained, though Sheriff Donovan had quietly removed those within the town limits after Thomas and Nora's wedding. As autumn progressed, and the first snow dusted the mountain peaks in the distance. Thomas and Nora prepared for the winter isolation ahead. They preserved fruits and vegetables, smoked meat, chopped and stacked firewood, and made sure the cabin was weathertight against the coming cold. "It's going to be a hard winter," Thomas observed one evening as they sat before the fire, Nora knitting while he cleaned his rifle. "Signs are all their thick husks on the corn, heavy fur on the rabbits, squirrels gathering more than usual." Nora looked up from her work. "Are you worried?" He considered the question. In previous years, the prospect of a severe winter had been concerning primarily for practical reasons. Would he have enough supplies? Could he keep the livestock alive? Would the cabin hold against the storms? But now his concerns were more complex, centered around Nora's safety and comfort during what might be months of isolation. "Not worried," he said finally, "just want to be prepared. Once the heavy snow comes, we could be cut off from town until spring thaw." "I'm not afraid of isolation," Nora assured him, setting aside her knitting to come sit beside him on the hearth rug. "Not with you." Thomas put an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Thinking we should make one more trip to town before the weather turns. Get any last supplies we might need." Nora nodded against his shoulder. "Perhaps I should come with you this time." It would be her first visit to Silver Creek since their marriage, and Thomas understood her hesitation. Though legally protected as his wife, the possibility of encountering someone connected to Victor Hargrove remained a concern. "Might be good for folks to see Mrs. Thomas Reed," he said carefully. "Put an end to any lingering questions." The next day dawned clear and cold, perfect traveling weather for their journey to town. Nora wore her warmest dress with a heavy shawl, her wedding ring prominently displayed on her gloved hand. Thomas noticed her nervousness as they loaded the wagon, but said nothing, understanding that this was a test of sorts, a first step toward reclaiming her freedom from fear. Silver Creek was bustling with pre-winter activity when they arrived, townsfolk similarly preparing for the months of isolation ahead. As Thomas and Nora made their way down the main street toward the general store, they drew curious glances but no outright hostility. Inside the store, the proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Reed, good to see you, and this must be the new Mrs. Reed I've been hearing about." Nora offered her hand with a confidence that made Thomas proud. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Jenkins. I've been enjoying the goods from your store these past months." As they selected their supplies, extra coffee, sugar, flour, ammunition, lamp oil, and various other necessities, Nora gradually relaxed, engaging in pleasant conversation with Mr. Jenkins and the other customers who came and went. No one mentioned the wanted posters or asked uncomfortable questions about her past. Their last stop was the post office, where Thomas regularly checked for infrequent letters from his sister in Pennsylvania. To his surprise, the postmaster handed him an envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand. "Came yesterday," the postmaster explained. "Addressed to Mr. Thomas Reed, rancher outside Silver Creek. Figured it must be for you, as there's no other Reed ranching in these parts." Thomas examined the envelope with a frown. The return address was Chicago, Illinois, with no name provided. A glance at Nora showed that she had noticed as well, her face suddenly pale. They waited until they were alone in the wagon, heading out of town, before Thomas opened the letter. Inside was a single page of expensive stationery, the handwriting elegant and precise. "Mr. Reed," it began, "I write to inform you that certain allegations regarding Miss Nora Winters, now apparently Mrs. Thomas Reed, are without foundation. The jewelry in question was indeed her rightful inheritance from her mother, and any claims to the contrary have been withdrawn. Furthermore, the engagement contract between Miss Winters and Mr. Victor Hargrove has been formally dissolved, as the Hargrove family wishes to avoid the scandal of further inquiry into certain business practices that might come to light in any legal proceedings. Miss Winters, Mrs. Reed should consider herself free of all obligations and accusations. This matter is closed. Respectfully, Jonathan Hargrove, Esq." Thomas read the letter twice, then handed it to Nora, who scanned it with trembling hands. "Jonathan Hargrove," she whispered. Victor's uncle. He's a senior partner in the family bank, but he and Victor have never gotten along. I'm surprised he would intervene. Sounds like your former fiancé may have overstepped, Thomas observed. Perhaps the family decided he was becoming a liability. Nora folded the letter carefully. Do you think it's genuine, that it's really over? Thomas considered the formal language, the expensive paper, the specific withdrawal of all claims. I think so, he said finally. A man like Jonathan Hargrove wouldn't put such statements in writing if he didn't mean them. Too much legal risk. Relief washed over Nora's face, followed quickly by a joy that transformed her expression. Free, she said, the word half laugh, half sob. Truly free. Thomas took her hand, squeezing it gently. You've been free since the day you decided to leave Chicago, he reminded her. This just confirms what we already knew, that you did nothing wrong. They rode in contemplative silence for a while, each absorbing the implications of the letter. The threat that had hung over them since Nora's arrival had been lifted, leaving them free to focus on their future together without looking over their shoulders. What shall we do with this new freedom? Nora asked eventually, her voice lighter than Thomas had ever heard it. He smiled, thinking of all the plans they had discussed in recent weeks, expanding the ranch, perhaps building a larger house eventually, maybe even starting a family when they were ready. Whatever we want, he answered simply. Together. Winter arrived in earnest the following week, a major storm bringing heavy snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine white expanse. The road to town disappeared completely, and the world beyond their property became inaccessible until spring. But Thomas and Nora found they didn't mind the isolation. Their cabin was warm and well-stocked, their livestock snug in the barn, and their days filled with the quiet rhythm of winter ranch life. In the evenings, they read aloud from the books Thomas had accumulated over the years, supplemented by several volumes Nora had purchased during their last trip to town. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festivity that Thomas had not experienced since childhood. Nora decorated the cabin with pine boughs and berries, crafted small gifts from materials at hand, and prepared special meals from their preserved stores. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged presents by the light of the fire, a hand-carved wooden box from Thomas for Nora's few pieces of jewelry, and a hand-knitted scarf from Nora for Thomas's rides in the cold. I have another gift, Nora said softly as they sat together watching the flames. One I couldn't wrap. Thomas looked at her curiously. We're going to have a child, she said, her eyes shining with joy and apprehension. In early summer, I think. For a moment, Thomas could only stare at her, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was telling him. Then, as the news sank in, a profound joy swept through him. A child, he repeated, reaching out to place a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. Our child. Nora covered his hand with hers. Are you happy? More than I can say, he answered truthfully. More than I ever thought possible. As winter gave way to spring, and spring to early summer, Thomas watched in wonder as Nora's body changed, nurturing the new life within her. He insisted she rest more, taking on additional chores himself, and even hiring a local boy to help with the heavier work when the roads cleared enough for travel. On a warm June morning, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and new calves gamboling in the pastures, Nora went into labor. The midwife from Silver Creek had been staying with them for a week in anticipation of this moment, and she calmly directed Thomas to heat water and prepare clean linens while she attended to Nora. The hours that followed were the longest of Thomas's life. Banished from the bedroom, he paced the cabin's main room, flinching at every sound of pain from beyond the closed door. Buck watched him anxiously, sensing his distress but unable to understand its cause. Finally, as afternoon faded toward evening, a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty cry of a newborn taking its first breath. Thomas froze mid-stride, his heart pounding as he stared at the bedroom door. After what seemed an eternity, it opened and the midwife emerged, tired but smiling. You have a daughter, Mr. Reed, she announced. A healthy, beautiful girl. Thomas entered the bedroom on unsteady legs to find Nora propped up on pillows, her face radiant despite her exhaustion, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. He approached the bed carefully, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face nestled against Nora's breast. The baby had a dusting of dark hair like her mother's, and when she briefly opened her eyes, Thomas caught a glimpse of deep blue that might eventually match his own. "She's perfect," he whispered, overcome with an emotion he had no name for, a mixture of love, pride, awe, and profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Nora stumbling into his wheat field a year ago. "What shall we call her?" Nora asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Hope," he suggested, "because that's what she represents for me, hope for a future I never dared imagine before you." Nora's smile deepened. "Hope Reed," she tested the name. "It's perfect." As summer turned to autumn, and autumn once again to winter, the little family settled into a new rhythm centered around Hope's needs and developmental milestones. The cabin that had once seemed more than adequate for a solitary man now felt cozier with 3 occupants, prompting Thomas to begin plans for an addition to be built in the spring. On a snowy December evening, as Hope slept peacefully in the cradle Thomas had crafted for her, he and Nora sat before the fire, her head resting against his shoulder as they enjoyed a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "You ever think about that day?" Nora asked. "When you found me in your field," Thomas smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Often," he admitted. "It was the luckiest day of my life, though I didn't know it then." "Mine too," she murmured. "I was so afraid, so desperate. I thought I was running away from something, but really I was running toward everything I ever wanted." Outside, snow fell silently, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the fire crackled, casting warm light over the cabin that had become a true home. Thomas Reed, once a solitary man haunted by war's shadows, looked at his wife and thought of their sleeping daughter, and knew with absolute certainty that he had found his place in the world. "I love you, Nora Reed," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of all they had experienced together. "And I love you," she replied, turning her face up to his for a kiss that held the promise of all the years to come, years that neither could have imagined when a lost woman stumbled into a wheat field. A cowboy gave her water, and forever after his heart.